and more recently as well, and there's some good examples of that which we can get into. I'll just say a couple of things about that. The Australian government, and Tim alluded to this, have been very keen on Aussie universities growing this area of their activity. It's a kind of win-win. It shows how the country can project its world-class education system around the world, and particularly into Asia, fosters connections, soft power, exposes our universities to more international engagement, and in more recent years, it doesn't come with the toxicity of more students coming over here and contributing in ways which are increasingly seen as negative, actually, to society. And that's a whole other topic, right, Tim? So TNE's become very political, but actually Aussie universities have been getting on with it for a long time. Australian universities and British universities in particular. So in these opening comments, I just wanted to say there's already a lot going on. There are a lot of different models. They're complex, they're highly contextual, and there are some big opportunities which I can guarantee all universities are looking at pretty seriously, from the branch campuses to continuing their sort of collaborative programs. One of the biggest things that we were just talking about before is that this is really quite challenging. There's lots of challenges, actually, to overcome: regulatory, sort of business challenges, and people challenges. This kind of staff component, which I know is our particular focus, how do we attract the talent? How do we employ the talent? How does that connect to our workforces back at our home campuses? How do we stop these operations kind of drifting off to be these kind of things which no one really knows about? What legal exposures might we be exposed to as a university? So I think my sort of opening comments, and I'll pass to colleagues, see if I've missed anything, I would say, this is kind of important, okay, for the next period of Australian universities' development. It's hard. There are a number of options that universities and their leaders can think about as they address this area from a workforce point of view. And there are a whole bunch of things that have happened and are happening, and we'll shed some light on them, which you might say are good use cases or even best practice examples of things that are taking place which can address those challenges, take the opportunity.
Any further thoughts? Did either of you want to add to the TNE environment before we move on?
I guess to add to that, it's not only the Australian government who's become very interested in promoting TNE. So if you look at China, in the last couple of years, they've been really ramping up their TNE. So last year was the highest number of joint programs and joint education institutes they approved, and in the first few months of this year, they've almost reached the number that they approved last year. So it's around 212 or something this year. Last year overall was another 285, and so that's China. If you look at India, they've also been very actively encouraging more foreign universities to come in and set up branch campuses. If you look at Southeast Asia, there's also Vietnam ramping up, there's the Philippines. So everyone, and as some of you may know, Malaysia and Singapore and Hong Kong have been long established, well-established locations for TNE delivery. So I think we're going to see a fundamental shift, in the next decade of more and more students actually studying TNE programs, rather than seeing that mobility that we have seen in the last 20, 30 years of students going to, the US, UK, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, for their study. Because aside from, restrictions to visas, affordability, there are other benefits to studying a TNE program at home, where you've got the connections, you've got industry connections, perhaps as well family connections. Those things are going to play out, and we'll probably see more TNE students than we've ever seen before.
I think you've both covered everything. The only other point, and I come from an international branch campus perspective as part of TNE, and TNE is made up of a number of component parts, from licensing and franchising of curriculums to joint institutes, joint ventures, joint programs. But I particularly look at international branch campuses and the risks around them as well, and the governance around them. Of course, it's a preferred option of the Australian government. I don't think that's a secret here, that transnational education or transnational higher education or transnational research higher education, the acronym just keeps growing. But with that comes a lot of risk, and I think particularly from a TEXA perspective, and something we're learning massively at Deakin, and I'm sure we'll get into the detail of that shortly.
Thank you. I think that's an excellent introduction. I guess by way of context, one of the reasons why we thought this was so important to have in the program is that the Australian government has been very explicit in saying this is the way they want our sector to go under current policy. They want more TNE. So each institution is going to need to grapple with what they're already doing or what they might need to do. We've also seen internationally a range of failed TNE campuses. There's this sort of older neo-colonial model where we go and transplant the Great British campus or the Great Australian campus, and everybody comes and has a little slice of Australia or Britain in Malaysia or India or be where it is. That type of model appears to be on the nose a little. There seems to be a great appetite for some more collaborative approaches to structuring TNE, but crucially in that there are a whole range of equity issues. Staff in offshore campuses get paid way less than Australian staff often. How do you deal with that? How do you get equity? How do you get a culture that translates, or does it have to translate at all? There's some of the things I really want to start grappling in. So let's jump into some of those first. Caryn, can you maybe start us off with, would there be a top 2 or 3 ingredients you'd have for successfully making a TNE arrangement work in terms of a staff workforce point of view?
And I just want to, for those of you who are not involved in TNE in your universities, there's, as Steve and John have pointed out, there are a range of different models. So offshore campuses, particularly the ones that are being developed now, are often still partnership models. So, people are, universities are setting up joint venture companies. So you're always dealing with a partner, and there will often be partner staff. They won't be your staff, they'll be partner staff. So in terms of Victoria University and our engagement with our partners, we have around 7,000 students offshore. That vary slightly because there are regulatory requirements as well. So in China, for instance, we have to deliver quite a lot of our curriculum. We have to do a lot of fly-in, fly-out. Our English language staff stay there for at least 6 months, usually a year. We've got quite a lot of delivery over there. So there's a lot of engagement, operationally. With some of our programs, like the one we have in Malaysia with Sunway, that's over 32 years old. So we don't do any more teaching. We've given them the VU block model, but we still have, for that range, we have specified roles and responsibilities for academic staff, as well as, within my team, we also have a partnership manager, we'll have a partnership coordinator, we have oversight, a director teaching and learning to oversee all that delivery and academic quality. So just going back to Tim's question about how, offshore staffing, if they're partner staff, then, we obviously the salary levels will be different. In terms of our own staff who travel there, one of the issues that I've in my 25 years of whatever of TNE is around workload models. So when I first arrived at VU, academic staff got overloading. Yeah, so they would be paid extra for the TNE teaching. And that was great for the staff. It wasn't great for the faculty because the staff were never around, or research outputs suffered. So now we have an allocation model which is quite detailed, and it took a while to sort out. So we follow the same model that the colleges offer. So if you're teaching, depending on how many hours you're teaching, if you're marking, if you're unit convening, those hours are all counted up for every single delivery or every single teaching location that you have. We also have campuses in Sydney and Brisbane, and there's oversight of that as well, and specified unit convening roles and site academic coordinator roles for each program and each site. So those are sort of very detailed, and you kind of do have to work through that, because otherwise you're not going to have staff you won't have clarity around around what their total academic workload is, and you won't get the buy-in. So that's one thing I think that's important.
Yeah, I think that's really useful you have to really jump into the detail to start to get some sense of how this is really going to work.
Yeah.
John, what have you learned over the time?
How long have you got? So first of all, just on the AWAM, so we've got the AWAM, and I'd just like to acknowledge our Pro-Vice Chancellor, Jacqueline Broadbent at the back here, who has just done a wonderful model for us in our DLI campus in Bandung. It's really complicated, talking to the partnership. It's Deakin and Lancaster and Navitas. Time zones from UK to Indonesia to Australia, so work hours are long. But Jacqueline just took on that challenge and knocked one together, made it look really easy. So thank you, Jacqueline. But I guess one of the key learnings, I'm probably talking from a learning perspective, we're quite green in comparison to VU, and we're in our third cohort next week of Gift City and our first cohort of our Bandung campus. But fundamentally, you need finance, you need P&C and HR, and you need legal in all these jurisdictions, and we're asking the same questions. Into the detail of a pay slip in India versus Indonesia. In Australia we have about 3 lines. In India and Indonesia it's like a transcript, and there's lots of negotiations that happen in between. But one of the biggest learnings I've got, and probably being a bit brave saying this, is that having your head academic on campus from your home campus. I think that's really, really important, and that link back to governance and academic governance particularly, and TEXA and compliance. And we've noticed the difference having somebody from Deakin in Bandung who really understands our systems versus somebody who doesn't, who is doing a great job, by the way. But there's a lot more work to do when you've not got one of either your COO or your academic, and I'd probably say your academic really should be the one on campus. And most models do that as well. And of course, value alignment is really, I can't underestimate how important the value alignment is. But also being really clear that you've got a really clear employment value proposition. So something we worked very, very close with our PNCs was around why would you come and work for Deakin? What's it about? What are we about? So we spent a lot of time, and we'll probably come to the models shortly.
Just on that, John, it's been seen as a bit of sometimes that optional prize. It's the dean who you want to move aside sideways, or the slightly troublesome executive who you want to move away from the chancellery, and they get that head of campus role offshore. They've never probably been there, or maybe they have, but they get it and they land. How do you house train them into being useful?
So Greg, for those of you who know, Professor Greg Barton is an expert in, I want to say, Islamic terrorism and other things, but he's very well known in Indonesia. So landing him in Indonesia was just perfect. Everybody knows him from government to industry to education institute. So he's really carried the brand for us there. So I think a little bit easier for us in Indonesia. In India is a little bit different. Of course, we're the first mover. Everything's hard when you're the first, and we're still trying to learn, and we're in a completely separate area. We're in a special economic zone rather than under the UGC, if you're familiar with India. So it's got different sets of regulations. But all TNE offshore, whether it's a campus or not, needs to meet the requirements of TEXA. And I guess as an institute, how much are you willing to have a black mark against your registration because of a small campus somewhere overseas with 20 students? And I'm guessing you wouldn't want to, so you need to be really careful in who you choose.
That's the perfect segue to Steve. Steve, you've done a whole range. I'm not going to read through your CV, but you've done many stints at many institutions. You're now looking at India in particular with ECA. What's your thoughts?
Okay. I was just reflecting on that question around, your sort of takeaways or your top tips. And just to come back on that, I think the key for any audience, whether you're a specialist in the area within a university or you're sitting somewhere else, is sometimes it can be really hard to get a real clear view of what your university is actually doing. Some universities are more centralised, some universities are more decentralised. One way to look at that is through a risk perspective, and you say, look, we're doing all this stuff. There's a people side to that. What's our kind of exposure? Getting some kind of insight into those relationships and those models is absolutely critical. And then to think about how best those things can be managed, I guess, and to think about John's comments just now, this leadership piece is really crucial. Leadership on the ground with these partnerships, if it's a branch campus and you've got a director or a dean or a provost there, yeah, fantastic if that's someone that's come from the home campus and has got the right context to go there, and you can think of it, it's got this sort of, cord almost, this imaginary cord coming back to the university. They understand how your university works. When you start up, that's really critical, because as I said earlier, otherwise it can seem very far away from everyone in the university, but then also kind of at the senior executive level as well. Who's sponsoring this thing? Who's going to, champion it internally and not kind of say, oh yeah, that relationship in Malaysia or wherever it is, yeah, I don't know much about that. That's somebody else's responsibility. So I think trying to get that internal insight and leadership. But my final point on observation is around these models are dynamic, right? And so if you were to kind of think of a conceptual model where you're starting up let's say a branch campus, which is what I'm involved in at the moment in India, yeah, we need a lot of input from the home university. We need people on the ground. You translate that, by the way, into the business model, and has a lot of cost, right, which is going in, but you've got to do it. And you need more, boots on the ground maybe at that stage of the relationship than you will in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, when hopefully you have managed to get a sustainable local operation where you're not feeling like you've got to have these senior people come in from the home campus to make it work. I think that's got to be really clear for me anyway. In 20 years' time, the India campuses I'm working on, it's got to be a localised staff with really considered connections into the home university which make it real. So kind of balancing that sort of risk and opportunity thing, I think, is important. The other thing I would reflect on, Tim and colleagues, is when you think about the staffing profile of a branch campus or a partnership where you as a university are responsible for providing staff, or maybe co-selecting them with your local university if it's a partnership, the way I think about it is there are foreign faculty, and those foreign faculty can divide into two. They can be academics coming from the home university, and I had to smile, Caryn, when you were talking about that with VU. I did work with Caryn at VU a few years ago, and staff, getting extra payments to go overseas and the sort of headaches that would cause us and everything else. But you've got a model where faculty and academics are going in, right, from the home campus. You've also got foreign academics who are actually in the market for this sort of thing. It's kind of a probably not very well understood segment of the global international academic workforce. And they're not itinerant academics, they're just academics who've built their career spending 3, 4, 5 years at University of Birmingham in Dubai. Now they're going to go to Monash, Malaysia. And there are people like that at every level, actually, from the leadership down. And then the third group are the local academics. They may already be at the university if it's a partnership, or they may be academics in the system of that country. And thinking about a blend of those three and how they integrate. Your point, Tim, was excellent earlier in your intro, that this disparity in pay is a real challenge, that you get the foreigners coming in and they're often maybe earning a lot more, because especially if they're from the home university and they're getting their terms and conditions, and that is a real challenge, right? But integrating quite a different workforce, I think, can be a bit of a challenge in my experience over the years.
Can I just add?
Yes,
Just on the sponsor, because it's really, really important, the sponsorship. So for Deakin, we had sponsorship from the Vice Chancellor and the senior executives from day one. It just had to be at that level. There's no way this would have happened without it. And we set up an international branch campus unit, which I head, which is unique, I think, for any university in the world, doesn't necessarily have that. And we're kind of the glue that works across, and I'll come to why. But you've got the sponsorship, the clear strategy, the operating model. So we work on a network operating model. So we work all the functional areas on the campus, and at Deakin have a connection back. And we've had design teams that have intentionally designed that area as well. And governance, and that's both academic and corporate. And I think we forget about the corporate governance. We talk a lot about governance in universities just on academic, but academic isn't the only governance we do. We do corporate governance as well. And uniquely, my unit gets to see both the academic and the corporate governance, and quite often the two pathways are separate as well. But this unit was set up purely as a result of being the glue, because the number of functional areas that are involved, and everybody's fantastic in the SMEs in the area they do, but there needs to be somewhere where the glue or pulls this together. And your point on leaving the leadership too long on the campus, you do need to check in. I found 10 years working in international, I think every 3 months you've got to do a bit of a check-in. You know, how are we going? Are we all on the same strategy here? Are we following the same path? How are our people going? And I think that's really important, which is... Yeah.
Can I make one quick comment? Just it's a little bit flippant. I had a meeting with a potential university partner. I should say the organisation I'm working with provide infrastructure, capital, local market knowledge, that sort of thing, work with universities, set up campuses overseas. I said to this Deputy Vice-Chancellor, you do realise that almost everything we do here is going to be harder than doing it in your home environment. He sort of looked at me and said, well, why would we do it? I said, because you've got to believe in the opportunity. But all of this stuff is not easy, from the workforce to every other element of it. But it doesn't mean we can't do it.
Now, do put up your hands if you've got questions as we're moving along. I wanted to follow up with Steve with an additional question: belonging, and that's maybe a question for all of you. But how do you foster belonging or a sense of, identity when you're going between countries?
I can start with that. I guess when you're setting up a new campus or a new partnership, it's really, you've got to take the staff who are working, who will be involved in that, along right from the start when you're implementing your work streams and making sure that everything is set up in accordance with your policies, but with your systems, etc. So that implementation and getting all those people involved from the start. But then we have, partnership governance was not mentioned, but I think that's also important. That with all our partnerships, we have a joint management committee, we have a joint operations team, we have regular catch-ups with our partner staff. So those things kind of keep our partners engaged. And I think the other thing that we've started as well, with support from some Victorian government funding, is a partner staff onboarding and resource portal that sits within our LMS. Every partner academic staff member has access to that. They have to complete a required number of academic integrity modules, but they also have within that things like, all the services that are available to our staff and students, whether they're library services, whether they're career services or academic support. That's all housed within the portal. We keep it live, making sure that we also give news updates of what's going on in all our partners. So that sense of belonging is also fostered that way. I don't know, there's probably more I can talk about.
I think, just to add to Caryn, I think we're relatively new, so we had a purist approach. We had our principles. We developed our operating model, our design, and what we're starting to see now is an acknowledgement that Deakin India it's not India, it's not Australia, it's somewhere in between. It's international, and so we're starting to tweak a little bit. And we have I would say a really contemporary capability framework at Deakin University domestically, and we've tried to apply that internationally, and I would say it hasn't landed quite as well. And as we all know, culture isn't a document that's sent on a PowerPoint presentation. That is developed on the ground by the people. So we start with some really, if I think tactically, you know, we have team charters. Again, why are you coming to work at Deakin? Well, they wanted to be part of the first of something. So it's part of their brand as well, to be part of something new, part of, you know, they get to do trilateral in partnerships, trilateral research. They get to come over and meet. We have mentorships. We have a knitting club, they call it, but there's no knitting. It's just academics coming together to work together and encouraging each other. The biggest challenge I think we found in belonging is I always say we're a TL with a small r, teaching, learning, research. And we're a small r in the early days because we need you to teach, and we need good student experience, and we need you to be focused on not being a research centre in the first year, and that will come over time. And that goes sometimes a bit against the quality aspect of delivering quality. You know, academic is, you know, they want to do their research. So we've had to find creative ways to work back within the institutes to do that, to be course supervisors of PhDs. So there's quite a bit of work on the academic side, more so than I've seen on the professional. I envisaged a small campus would have no difference between professional and academic. We wouldn't have that divide. It would just be one team. It worked for about 6 months. And then...
Well, 6 months is pretty amazing.
I know. So, but, you know, I still like to think we need to knock down that divide, respect each other's disciplines. As we do functional areas, we do that for functional areas. Why would we not do that any different? So that's going to take a bit of time. But they're finding their own feet now. I think the first year it was like, there's no research. We're going to, you know, things are going to fall down. But you've just got to find creative ways. And I think part of our roles, particularly in TNE, no matter what we're doing, we have to make decisions, because generally the home campus is a good starting point. But I always say we find a third place. You've always got to find the third place. It's India, Deakin, what's the third place? Or even a fourth place if you're in Indonesia and you've got UK, Indonesia, Australia. So our job's really to find that third and fourth place as well. We really want to keep all of our staff. We will, you know, there are salespeople as well, for, you know, they tell people about the experience, but we also acknowledge that people will move on. We've just graduated our first cohort at Deakin, so there's different phases of the campuses, and I think that's no different for our personnel as well. There's people who want to be in that fun, exciting establishment phase. Some want to do a little bit more BAU and not quite so much, so we'll see a bit of a churn, and that's just like any organisation.
Let's talk about mistakes. What have you seen? You don't have to talk about your own, but it's all. What have you seen in terms of some of the key, 2 or 3 key missteps that people have taken in setting up a campus? And don't have to name names. Just what's the types of things that will make people fail?
Just to flag something that you said earlier, actually, which is kind of not enough thinking around the leadership, right? And that can be the local leader, or it could be the person who's been sent. And there has been a bit of that over the years, and it's not easy, so I don't want to point fingers about this, but if you don't get the right person that you're sending out on your big Australian or UK or whatever salary, and they're not equipped to make it happen, then you've got a problem, because these campuses are basically like startups, right? And they're almost the opposite of what happens in most universities, which are very well established, big organisations with many different arms to them and doing lots of things and lots of innovation all the time within those contexts. But often the leader who goes to set up a TNE program, it's not so much they're on their own, but a lot is expected of them. And I've seen 1 or 2, where that's not quite worked. And that goes down to the kind of recruitment selection, and it's a headache all the time. How are we going to get the right person? There is a global talent sort of deficit in this space, actually. Our opening comments were about and Caryn said, the growth of transnational education. This is going to become bigger. It means that those kind of cottage industry approaches that maybe some institutions have taken, I've been involved with 1 or 2 of those scenarios, where you're thinking about, well, who can we get to go? Yep, you're the person, looks good, off you go. I think we're going to need to see a professionalisation of that, maybe leaning into that kind of third group I talked about, around people who've got the international experience but maybe aren't from your institution, balancing that off with what John said, which I agree with around, yeah, but the value of having someone from your institution at the outset is really important. So I think the leadership.
And I think we need to not just focus on the establishment of campuses or a new partnership. I mean, there are partnerships that are, you know, that being quite long-standing, or campuses that are long-standing that can kind of lose their way a little bit, you know, that belonging, that connection. So I think for me it's really very much around that mutual, you know, I see TNE as a coalition of the willing, to borrow, you know, a phrase from last year. And really it's about maintaining that sense that it is about mutual benefit. So the idea that in the past that, you know, TNE is all about, you know, us, that colonial mentality, as you mentioned earlier, John, it's no longer the case. I mean, they have as much to contribute to the home campus as we have to them, and we've got to find those connections and make the most of it, whether it's about industry connections, whether it's about community outreach. You know, those sorts of things are there, and you need to find those connections to be able to build that sense of belonging both ways.
Just on that point of colonialism, which, you know, is true and it's real, there's also a reverse colonialism, I'm going to be honest. When I go in country, I'm going on Wednesday, and I've been asked to speak at certain things because they want the Australian person there. That's all I'm going to say. And it's sometimes really uncomfortable, and I've been asked to present at conferences, and when I ask what is the conference about, oh, we just speak on whatever you want, and I'm like, not really, but they're a partner. So I've, the last few years, traveling to India and Indonesia, and been put in positions which I find a little bit uncomfortable as well. And students have said to me, John, I want to see staff from Australia. And I said, well, if what you're implying, the staff who are teaching this course back in Australia come from this very country. So I'm not sure what you're expecting, but you'll have the same people. So this expectation of the staffing as well is a bit of a problem. And we do a lot of work to explain where our staff come from and their backgrounds.
Stephen.
Yeah, thank you. How much time have you got? Monash started in Malaysia in the early 90s with Sungiway. They're now about to go into a process of building a second big Kuala Lumpur campus. It'll be huge. Took them a generation and a half. RMIT, where we are, one of the great successes. It's taken them 22 years in Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City. Wollongong has been quietly plugging away in the Middle East, as far as I can tell, making a good deal of money. There's a university in Queensland, which, as far as I can tell, is largely propped up by the earnings from its Southeast Asian campus. They all started in different times. I don't think you've got that 25, 30 years before economies, education systems in India and the region mature, where political changes make it harder. What's the game plan? How do you do it? How do you do it in a shorter time frame?
Yeah, that's all of what you said is true, and I would add to that by saying that all of those partnerships and campuses are 100% contextual, as all of this stuff is. They have had their ups and downs, but in the long run they succeed. I don't think there is a shortcut actually to an international branch campus. I'm working on a number in India at the moment, and the discussions I have with the university executives and their governing bodies is, yeah, this is a 10 to 20 year strategy. There is a disconnect actually on the strategic mindset of some of those people I'm talking to who are actually, their goal to do it seems to be more around revenue and profit than the other kind of benefits of reach, reputation, and long-term value creation. So I think the branch campus model, it is a kind of a long road, but I do think there are multiple TNE models, right? And some of them are faster, and some of them are more, technology enabled. And probably if we looked at those, however many tens, hundreds of thousands of TNE students are following Australian qualifications, you find an amazing amount of diversity. So I think those principles, again, around getting the right model, having real clear strategic insight, leadership, commitment, all the constituent parts that John mentioned earlier, That remains. But I'm super, I've got to think of a better word for it. I'm not cynical about it, but I'm really realistic about it, that this strategy is, a TNE strategy is super long term, and a university's got to be serious about it, right? That's all I can really say on it, I think.
And have objectives now that they look to carry out in 30 years' time?
Well, I think you face that kind of political problem, like governments do, that you've got leadership groups which appear to be on a shorter time cycle. That's a perception, whether that's true or not. And I think it's about our leaders taking a long-range view, and we should expect that from them, right? Like we expect it from our politicians who may only have a 3 or 4 year cycle. 30 years is a long view, right? And you're right, that is a very long term. But certainly 10, 15 years, they should be thinking about that. And you know, I was involved in a presentation a couple of weeks ago in London, actually, where I got the old graph out, which goes up and to the right, you know, in the outer years, it just kept on going. And you know, you've got to believe that's a possibility. And those governors, those council members that were in there sort of quizzed me on that. And you go, well, look, it is achievable, but you've got to be in it, again, for the 10 or 15 years beyond the time any of us in this room are involved. And probably in another 5 years, most of us won't be here. So you described the problem well, right? But it's that sort of strategic long-term planning challenge.
I've got a quick final question for you. Do we need a TNE school? We're very good at having isolated pockets of expertise in our sector. We're very poor at sharing.
Well, you don't need a TNE school. The International Education Association of Australia, some of you may know that there is a TNE network, and we have a 2-day forum coming up in late July, 23rd and 24th. We're also, you know, it's quite a collaborative network as well. We and there's more and more people coming in and wanting professional development in this field. But you're right. There's no course in, you know, running TNE programs.
Yeah, I was going to say TNE forum, but I think how many people are P&C HR people? Yeah, so I think I was saying at Deakin 7 years ago that we need to build capability within our P&C and HR and not go out to Ernst & Young or one of the top 4. Having come from one of the top 4, don't go out and get from there, build your internal capability. And part of the campuses for us and part of the business case that I put together was around building capability. And I'd say, Jacqueline, hopefully you'd agree, that our capability 5 years ago was like, why would we do this? How do we do this? To, oh yeah, it's complex, we can do it. So we built capability, I think, across functional areas, but I think the network needs to be broader than just international. There's a lot of international people, but I think P&C and HR, you need to go away and help us develop alt models, understand the local regulations and legislation, because it gets really quite complicated. In some countries, you're going back to your previous 20 years ago when you think of HR and finance, and that's all right because that's where people are at, and that's something we have to remember as well. When we go into these countries, we've got to meet people where they're at. That's that third place, right? We cannot force, and one of the things we did, a big lessons learned was, you know, we were trying to force a particular system on a country, and I was like, that's just not going to happen, but I'll bring you with me and you'll see why. You know, the old stamp and the rubber stamp and the usual things. So we've got to meet people where they are. So I guess my advice is get more people in the network that are not just in international, because we all know this. We need people in finance, HR, P&C, academia to actually come and support us and be part of the solution, and know that there will be a solution, because there's lots of them. There's 368 branch campuses in the world. There's 750 joint institutes been approved in China in the last couple of years. So there's a lot coming at us. So I think for you, it would be great if you can build your internal capability, because you'll be worth your weight in gold.
So do we need a TNE school? I think the International Aid Association that Caryn spoke about is quite vibrant. Actually, there's sort of growing capability, I think, in the sector. I reflect back personally. So I was on the senior exec at VU for 7 years, and under my responsibility, amongst other things, was TNE and international student recruitment. I can count on the number of 2 fingers probably, the amount of times I've ever asked by the University Council, or actually pretty much by the Vice-Chancellor, what's going on with TNE, unless there's a problem, unless there's a risk, compared to the amount of times you've got to front up around what's happening with the revenue from student recruitment. Now that's a few years ago, and I've sensed a bit of a change around universities seriously trying to grapple with the strategic opportunity, you know, that we flagged, which is long term, and how the capability needs to flow. And I think, you know, John's sort of case study in a way. At Deakin is a great example of that. And then with sort of Caryn's experiences at VU, of a university that's been doing it for a while. But yeah, we're going to have to get better at it, right, Tim?
Fantastic. Well, I really have enjoyed this discussion. Thank you for your expertise and your insights. I loved that we went quite deeply into some detail as well as talking about the broader issues. So if you'll put your hands together and thank Caryn, John and Steve.